The Final Fantasy saga continues on Game Boy Works episode 122. A year and a half into Game Boy's life, we've already seen a handful of sequels to titles that originally debuted on Game Boy. Most of them have been, shall we say, uninspiring. Voxel 2 and its dozens upon dozens of slow, box-pushing puzzles, and Trump Boy 2 with its mediocre card games, livened up only by support for 4-player connectivity. But this week, we have a real winner, the Final Fantasy Legend 2.
Fittingly, the world's first great portable sequel comes to us from the same series that gave us the world's first portable role-playing game. Squaresoft's Final Fantasy Legend series, better known as SaGa in Japan, has quite a legacy behind it. These days, SaGa is probably best known as that weird RPG series with beautiful art, but which doesn't make any sense. But looking back at its 8-bit origins, you can see where the modern games came from. The series' opaque design tendencies fit in a lot better with the standards of the 8-bit era than they necessarily do now. Games in general made very little effort to explain themselves in the late NES, early Game Boy era. The more complex the game, the more they tended to leave players to sort things out for themselves. In a time when adventure games could get away with bizarre and unintuitive puzzle designs, when platformers would force you to navigate false hints from dishonest villagers in order to advance, a game where eating monster meat causes one of your characters to transform into something potentially more powerful or vastly less useful according to an arcane and unexplained hidden hierarchy hardly seemed out of line. The SaGa games come to us from the same mindset that defined the skills and potential of a given Pokemon according to mysterious hidden values. The difference being that Pokemon became way more popular than SaGa, so fewer people have made an effort to dissect the inner workings of SaGa. The original Final Fantasy Legend, or Makaitoshi Saga, hit Japan in December of 1989, and the US nearly a year later. Shortly after its US release, SaGa 2 debuted in Japan, and in many ways represents the pinnacle of the franchise. Everything interesting and weird about the Final Fantasy Legend is carried forward into Final Fantasy Legend 2. But now it's bigger, more complex, more geared toward creating freedom and potential for the player. It also features a more concrete quest, better defined characters, a more refined character stat system, a new race of player characters to choose from, and a central storyline that provides players with unique power-ups to allow further customization. It's a great role-playing adventure by any standard, but it's also a brilliant encapsulation of everything the SaGa series is about. As with the Final Fantasy Legend, the sequel comes to us from a team headed up by Akitoshi Kawazu, who to my knowledge is the only Squaresoft employee from the 8-bit era to remain with the company to this day. Currently, Kawazu is a tenured executive, which means he does a lot of management type stuff, then cashes in his seniority chips every once in a while to ram another SaGa game through the production pipeline. And as with the previous game, this has nothing whatsoever to do with Final Fantasy beyond being a menu-based role-playing title by someone who happened to work on Final Fantasy and its sequel. The series' title in the West was strictly a play by Square's US arm to help the first game ride the coattails of the heavy marketing push Nintendo had invested behind Final Fantasy for NES, which had been published a few months prior as a first-party title. No doubt the co-branding helped this game's fortunes. It also gave it a second life nearly a decade later. Following the immense success of Final Fantasy VII for PlayStation and the Game Boy's second win following Pokemon, Sunsoft saw an opportunity and snatched up the rights to republish the Final Fantasy Legend trilogy for a fresh audience. Note that while I say trilogy, in reality that's only somewhat the case. After completing Final Fantasy Legend 2, Kawazu's team moved along to 16-bit hardware and began developing Romancing Saga for Super Famicom, while a different team created the third Game Boy entry. And that's fine. Again, in many ways, this is the SaGa series' high point, a game perfectly suited to its era and technology, and one that in many ways was well ahead of its time. Final Fantasy Legend 2 builds heavily on the principles of the first game, which in many respects drew upon design concepts that first emerged with the Japanese version of Final Fantasy II. All of these games reflect Kawazu's background and interests, which is to say his love for Western-developed role-playing games and tabletop gaming. The SaGa games feel less rigidly numeric than their contemporary Japanese console RPGs. Simply earning experience points and leveling up statistics by fixed increments at predictable intervals based on the value of defeated foes doesn't exist here. Instead, the systems here have a more chaotic tendency, reminiscent of tabletop mechanics like Thaco. As in the first Final Fantasy Legend, the world here doesn't feel like your typical RPG kingdom. This adventure takes place across a complex universe of interlocking cosmic pillars, with a cosmology filled by beings that appear to come from a wide array of mythologies and pantheons: Sumerian, Norse, Egyptian, and Japanese, among others. The turn-based combat is probably the most normal thing about Final Fantasy Legend 2. It takes the form of a fairly standard, for the time, first-person perspective in which the foes depicted on screen may represent an entire group of identical monsters, as seen in various Dragon Quests, Phantasy Stars, and Wizardries. Both parties act en masse, with turn order determined by speed rating. You can launch ranged and melee physical attacks, cast spells, and use items. So far, so normal, but Final Fantasy Legend II becomes considerably more unconventional once you dig into the fine details of the mechanics. Weapons suffer from degradation, meaning that tools like blades and guns have a limited number of uses and break once they're depleted. On the other hand, you can also equip martial arts skills. These are unusual in that they also have limited uses, but they grow more powerful as they approach depletion, presumably the implication being that you achieve mastery through use, which turns them briefly into devastating powers once you grind up your experience with them. Spells also come with a limited number of casts, though only spellbooks are finite. The natural magic possessed by mutants, along with monster skills, can be replenished by resting. However, you're less limited in how you can gear up as you are in other RPGs. Each party member can hold and equip up to 8 items at once, besides monsters which lack inventory slots, and these items can include basically anything. That includes weapons, armor, spellbooks, consumable goods, and more. Interesting questions emerge from this feature. What are your optimal gear arrangements? How liberally should you use a powerful weapon, which might not easily be replaced once it's spent? Do you load down a mutant with protective gear, or leave their inventory slots open to learn spells? And do you dare allow your monster to eat that enticing hunk of meat? It's an unpredictable and sometimes temperamental game, yet Final Fantasy Legend II doesn't feel entirely unfair. On the contrary, it includes some quality of life and design elements that rarely appeared in RPGs of this vintage. For starters, one of the more interesting features of Final Fantasy II carries over here. Your 4-character party is often accompanied by one of several 5th-slot guest characters, who typically bring unique skills and strength to the mix. These range from Mr. S, a one-eyed monster that is also a school teacher from your home village, to Mr. Mask, a guy who looks curiously like Indiana Jones in the manual, and a lot like the main character's long-missing father in-game. The fact that the main character has a father to begin with speaks to Final Fantasy Legend II's greater emphasis on story. The previous game had the most bare-bones plot imaginable. More a premise than a story, really. Here, your character is driven by a desire to round up mystical artifacts, both to help protect the world, but also to bring them closer to their missing father, who vanished while hunting for these relics. These artifacts, called MAGI, number nearly 80 in total, and each one contains a special power. The one MAGI you carry at the outset, the Prism, has the power to reveal the number of other MAGI hidden within the world you're currently located in. Other MAGI can be equipped to grant you stat boosts, new skills, or other powers, and unlike weapons, they don't suffer from permanent degradation. MAGI can be a great way to further customize your party and work beyond their innate racial limitations. As in the first game, you choose a species for both your protagonist and their companions at the outset of the adventure. Unlike in the first game, however, these aren't treated as generic recruits, but rather as your childhood friends who accompany you on your quest. This means you don't just head back and pick up a new recruit once an ally kicks the bucket. Final Fantasy Legend II lacks the life point mechanic of other SaGa games, and in fact it has the friendliest fail state ever seen in the franchise. When your party falls, you're given another chance by the god Odin, who has effectively adopted your crew as his chosen heroes. This makes death and failure much less daunting, at least up until the point that you have to fight Odin to prove your mettle, after which he's no longer alive to help you out. It's one of the earliest instances of a JRPG combining an element in both a mechanical and narrative sense. The game is also friendly to players by including a memo feature, a sort of in-game glossary that explains key terms and can help nudge you back onto the proper story track if you wander off too far. The US manual is also unusually helpful, taking the form of a massive 64-page booklet that breaks down its unconventional mechanics and systems in plain English, provides helpful strategic planning advice, and walks you through the game's first world. In a lot of ways, this might be the friendliest and most accessible console RPG to have appeared in the US since the original Dragon Warrior hit the NES, which is quite a contrast to the SaGa series' current reputation. Granted, in some ways, this is all relative. 8-bit RPGs tend to be so minimalistic, bare bones really, that any little nicety seems like a grand gesture to player convenience. But there's a lot to be said for the overall effectiveness and balance of Final Fantasy Legend II's design also. By nature, the game is fairly open-ended, but it manages not to be too needlessly abstract. It's broken up into multiple worlds, which you can travel between freely as you open new ones. But this segmenting helps make your quest more manageable. Your mission to collect Magi is facilitated by the fact that your prism shows the number of Magi remaining in the current world, which provides a sense of how much work remains to be done, and when it's time to move along. Each world is fairly compact, too, which minimizes the possible number of things you can do at a time and helps prevent you from wandering aimlessly or following improper leads. Final Fantasy Legend II does a great job of walking the line between freedom and guidance, giving you a fairly extensive palette of choices, but providing enough boundaries and forgiveness that you never feel lost or overwhelmed. A big part of that freedom comes in selecting your party makeup. Final Fantasy Legend II expands on the system established in the first game, where previously you could build a party of 4 from a pool of 3 different races. Here you have 4 different race types to choose from. As before, there are humans, mutants, known as espers in Japan, monsters, and robots. Of the returning races, only monsters work exactly as they had before. Monsters possess innate skills that have limited uses, but which can be replenished by resting at inns. The exact skills a monster possesses depends on its form, and also a certain degree of randomization. When a monster in your party evolves, it acquires some, but rarely all, of its species' powers. As for the process of evolution, that works here as it did before. Non-humanoid foes will sometimes drop meat when defeated in combat, and a monster that eats a fallen enemy will mutate into a new species. How exactly this evolution plays out is determined by the game's most complex system, a series of interrelated hierarchies that are never explained within the game. Monster evolution isn't random, but it is a crapshoot until you track down a chart somewhere online because there are so many different factors involved. Each monster type belongs to a different family, or phylum maybe, and each of these families has multiple tiers of strength. Eating the meat of a creature from a higher tier than your current state of existence will almost certainly result in your monster evolving into a more powerful form. But exactly which family it will end up in depends on its current family and the family of the meat donor. It's also possible to downgrade in power if your donor kebabs come from a creature in a weaker tier. While there are a handful of certainties when it comes to evolution, like the fact that eating a boss's meat will always make you powerful, everything else about monster management involves a certain degree of experimentation and risk. And even subsisting on an all-boss diet is no guarantee of success, because each boss-induced evolution will lag behind in power by the time you reach the next boss, meaning your monster will be the least useful member of your party in every boss battle if you don't take some dietary risks. This is why the manual strongly cautions against building an all-monster party. But even if you don't want to try to get by with all monsters all the time, having one monster on hand is incredibly valuable thanks to their potential for radical strength boosts and the renewable innate capabilities. On the flip side of monsters, the new robot class is wholly predictable and manageable. There's no randomness to robots. Robots can equip anything, everything, weapons, armors, consumables, whatever you want. The trick about sticking gear on a robot is that once you equip that item, its durability is instantly halved. Stick a sword with 60 attacks on a robot and you create a sword with only 30 attacks. Unequip it, and its potency will be reduced to 15 attacks. While this sounds counterproductive, there's an upside to robot gear degradation. A tool set to a robot confers stat boosts to the robot, and on top of that, it ceases to be destructible. When a weapon or consumable is set to be part of a robot's loadout, resting will replenish it to its max, just like a monster skill. The downside to all of this is that building a robot costs money, and a lot of it. Since a robot never gains natural power-ups, you need to invest heavily in keeping its strength up to snuff as you venture into new areas with more powerful monsters and more impressive gear. It's also worth noting that degradation values round down when cut in half by being set to a robot. So if you try to attach one of the game's rare, powerful, single-use weapons to a robot for infinite durability, you're in for a sad surprise when its one use is cut to a half use, which is then rounded down to 0 uses. Meanwhile, human and mutant growth is the midpoint between the wholly natural evolution of monsters and the wholly gear-based advances of robots. Unlike in the first Final Fantasy Legend, humans no longer have to suck on strength potions for stat gains. They gain power the fitful SaGa way. That is to say, as they make use of a stat in combat, it has a chance to grow once the battle is over. Take damage and your hit points or defense may level up, but lay into foes with axes or spellbooks, and your strength or spirit may rise. The more powerful the foe you face off against, the greater the likelihood you'll see post-combat gains. It's not exactly predictable, but on the average, it's reliable. Mutants work much the same with a few differences. For one thing, human party members tend to emphasize physical strength with their natural power growth, while mutants grow more quickly in terms of magic and spirit. Secondly, humans have greater liberty to equip gear. Mutants can carry just as much gear as they like, of course, but as many as 4 of a mutant's inventory slots can contain a naturally occurring spell. By filling their inventory with items, you restrict the number of innate magic powers they can learn. As in the first game, the spells and skills a mutant knows at any given time are granted entirely at random and may change after any battle, regardless of their actions or the foes they face. Some spells are incredibly useful, such as elemental powers that hit an entire enemy formation. Others may be simply supplemental skills, such as resistance to fire or alertness to prevent ambushes. It's entirely possible, and likely, that your mutant party members will find themselves in possession of the same skill in multiple slots. That's great when it's a powerful elemental power that hits the innate weaknesses of monsters in your current area, but less useful when you have 2 ice resistance buffs in a zone populated by fire-casting monsters. It's also possible that your mutant may briefly possess no useful skills whatsoever, but such inconveniences rarely last for long. A mutant's unpredictability is their big drawback, but their potential for developing enormous power and the way their skills neatly dovetail with those of humans makes them a compelling addition to your roster. The randomness and opacity of the game's systems certainly means it's possible to create an impossible situation for yourself. The manual repeatedly cautions against building a party of all monsters or all robots. But generally speaking, Final Fantasy Legend II gives you the freedom to fail and the empowerment to pick yourself up and try again. It's a fondly remembered game for good reason. And that's not even getting into some of the quirkier localization choices, like the part where you bust up a heroin trade ring in the Japanese version being rendered as a banana smuggling operation in English due to Nintendo of America's content guidelines. Honestly though, that isn't too wildly out of keeping with the tone of the game. The main character's father, for example, is depicted as a bit of a goofball right from the start, thanks to his compulsive habit of entering and exiting the scene by sneaking through windows. And the world is presented as a bizarre structure where monsters, humans, mutants, and robots live together, ruled over by gangster-like deities and cosmic thugs. It's easily a top 3 Game Boy role-playing game, and it embodies all the concepts and mechanics that make the SaGa series so intriguing while minimizing the franchise's more alienating extremes. Now, this is not a perfect game by any stretch of the imagination. Besides its mechanical opacity, it's an intensely grind-heavy game that really requires players to fight practically every battle that comes along in the hopes of earning cash on random stat gains. And since it has the kind of hyper-accelerated encounter rate you'd expect from an 8-bit RPG, that's a lot of battles.
Final Fantasy Legend II remains fairly accessible. Thanks to its reissue in the late 90s, it remains a relatively inexpensive retro game pickup. In Japan, it's even easier, as the game was reissued for Nintendo DS in a proper remake in the style of Final Fantasy III and Final Fantasy IV. While the game was never officially localized, it has been fan-translated. And the original Game Boy version of the game, not the remake, is available this week on Nintendo Switch with the Collection of SaGa Final Fantasy Legend compilation, along with the first and third games. Next time on Game Boy Works, back to games you don't care about.